So Mika is currently a PhD student in the Department of Computer Science at Stanford, advised by Professor Leonidas Givas. She is generally interested in computer vision, graphics, ML, particularly focusing on the representation and generation of 3D objects and scenes, and have a couple of works on mesh deformation, CAD modeling, and the neural implicit fields. And her research goal is to achieve high quality photorealistic reconstruction and user controllable 3D generation. And yeah, we can see your slides. Go ahead, Mika.
Never mind. All right. So the title of my talk today is Towards Controllable Scene 3D Content Creation by Leveraging on Geometric Priors. So the one goal of learning structural and compositionality of data is to achieve automated 3D content creation that would otherwise be tedious or laborious for for users. But a key property that is important for content creation to be useful is user controllability. And for example, a user might want to plop a desk a lamp on a desk, but then not you want to be able to control what you're generating such that it is an appropriate let's say object that is coherent with the scene. Or let's say you want to put the chair on a beach and you want a particular style that would fit the context of the scene. So there are various forms of user control. Is there? Never mind. So previously, we've explored different works that enable user control, such as conditioning on target scans, or even programmatic edits through CAD. In this talk, I would particularly be focusing on two works on enabling control via semantics for objects and sparse input views for scenes. And to enable this, I would be talking about leveraging on two different types of geometric priors. So first, semantics for objects is I'll be first talking about de facto, a very recent work that is led by George. George is an undergrad that I mentor in Stanford, and just a special shout out, he will be applying for PhD in the next intake. So it is controllable part-based generation with cross diffusion. And so the prior that we are leveraging here, the geometric prior is semantics. And modeling semantics enables us to have explicit user control. And this this allows us to have semantically meaningful knobs that allow for fine-grained edits, such as resampling different parts while keeping other parts fixed, or sampling different configurations or transformations of the parts. So we want to model a generative shape latent space that allows us for these fine-grained control. And in contrast to let's say existing works wherein you model the whole shape latent space as it is. So when you sample, you can achieve let's say all the very different types of chairs that may not be suitable for the scene that you are trying to create. But so it has limited usability. However, with controllable generation in parts, we are able to better adapt what we want to create for the particular context. So first, we want before going into the method, we first talk about how we represent objects. So objects that we represent are decomposed into part styles and part transformations. So for any shape S, we first have we first model its canonicalized parts, or what we call part styles. And conditioned on these part styles, we have for each one of them, there are transformations that will lead to the output shape. So the canonicalized parts is basically factoring out the transformation being scale and position, and inherently just capture the geometric or structural or topological properties of the semantic part. And then the transformation is taking these canonicalized parts and then fitting it into a coherent object. And why, one side note on why this is not too straightforward is actually if you're given canonicalized parts, there are multiple explanations on for example, each of the colored points here represent one part. So there are multiple possible transformations that will output a coherent or valid object. So we need to be able to learn how to capture these variable modes, wherein like in our data, we might only have one like discrete samples for each particular shape. So concretely, in order to take this representation and put it into the method, we propose a factorized joint prior. So instead of having a prior which is on the whole shape space, we have a prior that is a first modeling independent part styles, or P of Z, and then conditioned on these part styles, we model the transformations. And the inherent assumption is like for each part style, we have like independence, which means we can sample each different style separately. And then we have a conditional distribution that conditions on this set of like canonicalized parts to output different transformations or variations of the particular object. So in summary, de facto proposes a shape space factorization that enables, that decomposes shapes into part styles and part transformations. So P of S, which is the shape would be factorized into these three components. And in summary, because time is short, like there are three components, which is a part stylizer, the transformation sampler that we talked about in the previous slide. But the crux, or one key component of like in our contribution, is this cross diffusion network that allows to model the to stitch both the style and the transformation together to output a coherent shape. So it views shapes as like a joint distribution of like styles and transformation. And the idea behind this method, so it is a transformer-based architecture, but we also reformulate or like generalize the forward diffusion kernel. So instead of having one Gaussian ball that plops into a whole shape, we have, like, as you can see in the figure, multiple balls that are transformed, like related to the part transformer, and then outputs like a coherent shape in the end. So because of all this, like with this design, we show like different applications that allows us for first like part level sampling. So we can keep like anything that's gray is something that's kept fixed, and the colored points refers to something that we resample. So we can keep parts fixed and resampling other parts and still create like coherent shapes. Or we can even like resample all other parts while keeping one of them fixed. So in the right, yeah. And this allow, like we showed that in different metrics that we can beat like existing baselines in like point cloud generation. Another application is like transformation sampling. So with fixing the part styles, we can resample different transformations that will create variations of the shape, as shown here. Then we also have like part level mixing. So taking one part from each of the shape, and then how do you stitch it together to create like a coherent shape? And like we can compare with existing works such as like Amir Spaghetti, or like a modified version of ShapeGF and Lion, and show that because we are modeling the joint distribution of parts and transformations, we are able to output like a coherent shape that are like connected. Yeah. And then we could interpolate like a particular part latent space, as shown here. So we see that as we interpolate through like a single part, the other parts can co-vary or adapt to snap the shape together and output still like a plausible output, as shown like by the lamp head. As we make the body thicker, like the head is also like adjust accordingly to make the output consistent. And we can see that there are different, as we interpolate as well, it keeps itself to the valid space of shapes, as shown by those like discrete jumps of like the airplane and the chair. Yeah. And then I would like transition a bit to a second part of like a different mode of control, which is instead of like object parts, is like we have sparse input views. So from objects, we also transition to scenes. And like this is like viewing like 3D content instead of like an explicit representation, as shown in the earlier work. So this is a coordinate-based or a neural field type of presentation. So this is a work that will be presented in CVPR. So please come into our poster as well. So it's SCADE, which is nerfs from space carving with ambiguity-aware depth estimates. So given sparse input views, we are also, if we want to create like 3D content, in this case represented as a nerf, how do we use sparse inputs to constrain the optimization? So because the inputs are sparse, like you want a user to like only snap a few images of the scene and still create this, like recreate or reconstruct the 3D scene. But because of its under constraint nature, we have to leverage on a geometric prior. And the prior that we leverage on is monocular depth estimation. However, like monocular depth is monocular depth is a generalizable prior, meaning there are a lot of pre-trained models that are on diverse large data sets that allow us to like capture different structures or like geometries of the scene. However, we know that it is inherently ambiguous. So given a single image, there are multiple plausible explanations of the particular scene. Such ambiguities arise from like albedo versus shading, scale, or even non-opaque surfaces. So now the question becomes, because it's ambiguous, how do we handle this ambiguity and still model or still leverage on this prior to create the scene? So in contrast to existing monocular depth works, we instead represent depth as a distribution instead of a point estimate. And in order to do this, we utilize like CIMLE. So in like given an image, we take a state-of-the-art monocular depth estimation network, in this case, LaRez. We add the latent code or use the CIMLE technique, which is a simple addition of like a set of added-in layers to instead produce a distribution for depth. So now this is what we call our ambiguity-aware prior. And this allows us, what we see is like to model the different ambiguities inherent to monocular depth estimation, such as like albedo versus shading. So you could see like on the door frame, you have like different samples modeling the different ambiguities. And then you have like scales of concavity, such as how deep or how curved the sofa is, and non-opaque surfaces such as like glass through a glass, wherein you could see that certain estimates shoot through the glass and certain other estimates like terminate at the glass. So using this, we are able to, like, given sparse input views, each of these sparse input views would have its own set of depth hypotheses as shown. So you could see like we really model like different discrete mode jumps. However, they are still valid. Now the issue is like, how do we disambiguate or like make it coherent in a 3D representation? So we resolve these ambiguities by fusing these information from the sparse views through a NERF. And the key idea of all of this is to utilize like classical space carving. So we like our approach is a probabilistic analog to this classical technique, which is like, so now like, let's say given like two cameras, for simplicity, let's say each of these two cameras have like two different hypotheses. So now how do we resolve or like pick hypotheses that are consistent or coherent across the scene? Is like one, you could imagine like, let's say this depth hypothesis like green 2 is not consistent with either of the two yellow hypotheses. Because if it were, then there should not be like the space on the green cone should be clear. So that is like the analogy, intuitive analogy to what we do in our losses. But using this technique, we are able to like fuse the different information from multiple views given a NERF. And the summary of the pipeline is given sparse input views. We extract our depth estimates from our prior, and then throw it into a NERF with our proposed space carving, probabilistic analog of a space carving loss to generate, like to reconstruct the 3D scene and create like, let's say a scene content conditioned on input views. And yeah, and these are more results, but we could talk more in detail in our in the poster session on Thursday. But yeah, thank you. And this code for SCADE is released, and paper for both and project websites are all online.
If you have any questions for Mika,